$590 billion. 183,000 workers. 3,400 tons of gold. 7 years of construction. And according to ancient records, not a single hammer was heard on the building site. 3,000 years ago, King Solomon launched a project so ambitious that even modern engineers struggle to comprehend its scale. More expensive than the International Space Station, more valuable than many of the world's greatest skyscrapers combined. Its walls shimmered with gold. Its chambers housed the most sacred object in Israelite history, and its construction changed the fate of an entire kingdom. But behind the glory was another story, a story of unimaginable wealth, of international diplomacy, of forced labor, and of a mysterious building process carried out in complete silence. Today, we're uncovering the incredible story of Solomon's Temple, the most expensive project of the ancient world. For more than 4 centuries, the Israelites worshipped God through a portable sanctuary known as the Tabernacle. It traveled with them through deserts, wildernesses, and generations of uncertainty. But by around 1000 BC, everything had changed. King David had united the tribes of Israel. He had conquered Jerusalem and transformed it into the political and spiritual center of his kingdom. As peace and prosperity began to emerge, David developed a dream. He wanted to build a permanent house for God, not a tent, not a temporary sanctuary, a magnificent temple worthy of the Creator of the universe. Yet, according to biblical tradition, God refused David's request. The reason was simple but profound. David was a warrior king. His reign had been shaped by battles, campaigns, and bloodshed. The temple would symbolize peace. Therefore, it would be built by a man of peace. That man was Solomon. Even his name reflected his destiny. Derived from the Hebrew word shalom, Solomon's name carried the meaning of peace, rest, and wholeness. When David approached the end of his life, he passed this mission to his son. But Solomon inherited far more than a dream. He inherited the greatest building fund the ancient world had ever seen. For decades, David prepared for a temple he would never live to see completed. Every military victory, every tribute payment, every successful trade agreement, all of it contributed to a single purpose. Ancient records describe staggering reserves of wealth. 100,000 talents of gold, 1 million talents of silver, additional gold from David's personal fortune, precious stones filling entire storehouses, bronze and iron in quantities too large to measure. When translated into modern figures, the numbers become almost unbelievable. The gold alone amounted to roughly 3,400 metric tons. At modern market prices, that represents nearly $493 billion. The silver added another $80 billion in value. Combined, the treasure approached an astonishing $590 billion. For comparison, the International Space Station cost approximately $150 billion. Solomon's temple possessed nearly 4 times that value in precious metals alone. Yet money could not solve every problem. Israel had gold. What it lacked were skilled craftsmen, specialized materials, and the engineering expertise required for a project of this scale. To find those resources, Solomon turned north, toward the greatest trading kingdom of the Mediterranean world. The mountains of Lebanon held one of the ancient world's most valuable resources, the Cedar of Lebanon. Tall, strong, resistant to decay. Ancient rulers prized these trees for palaces, temples, and monumental architecture. The forests were controlled by King Hiram of Tyre. Tyre was a maritime powerhouse. Its ships dominated Mediterranean trade routes. Its craftsmen were famous throughout the ancient Near East. Solomon reached out to Hiram and proposed an alliance. The arrangement benefited both kingdoms. Israel would supply enormous quantities of grain and olive oil. Tyre would provide cedar, cypress timber, precious materials, and master craftsmen. Among them was Huram Abi, a highly skilled artisan capable of working with gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, wood, and textiles. Soon, thousands of cedar trees were cut in Lebanon. The logs were tied together into giant rafts. They floated south along the Mediterranean coast. Eventually, they reached the port of Joppa. But that was only half the journey. Jerusalem stood high in the hills. Every beam still had to travel dozens of miles inland over rugged terrain. No trucks, no cranes, no modern roads. Only ropes, sledges, animals, and human determination. The materials were arriving. Now Solomon needed a workforce large enough to transform them into a temple. The scale of Solomon's labor force was extraordinary. Ancient records describe approximately 183,000 workers dedicated to the project. 30,000 Israelites worked in Lebanon cutting timber. Unlike others, they served in rotating shifts. 1 month of labor, 2 months at home. Beneath them stood a much larger workforce. 80,000 stone cutters, 70,000 carriers. Together, they formed the backbone of the construction effort. Most of these laborers were not Israelites. They came from conquered populations that remained within Solomon's kingdom. For many, labor was not voluntary. It was compulsory service to the state. The work was exhausting. The burden was heavy. And resentment slowly grew beneath the surface. One official observing these tensions was a young administrator named Jeroboam. Years later, after Solomon's death, Jeroboam would become the leader of a rebellion that divided the kingdom in two. In a strange twist of history, the temple that symbolized national unity also helped create the conditions for future division. If you're enjoying this journey through ancient history, consider subscribing and sharing your favorite fact from today's story in the comments below. Because the most astonishing chapter is still ahead. Imagine standing near the Temple Mount during construction. You would expect noise. Hammering, chiseling, shouting workers. Instead, ancient texts describe something remarkable. Silence. No hammer was heard. No chisel struck stone. No iron tool echoed across the construction site. This was not an engineering necessity. It was a spiritual principle. Iron represented weapons. Weapons represented war. The temple represented peace. Therefore, every stone was prepared elsewhere. Deep underground, quarry workers shaped enormous blocks to precise dimensions. When the stones reached Jerusalem, they were already finished. Workers simply assembled them into place. The process resembled a gigantic, prefabricated puzzle. Each piece had to fit perfectly, without computers, without laser measurements, without modern engineering technology. Yet somehow it worked. For 7 years, millions of stones moved from darkness into daylight. And slowly, one of history's most magnificent structures emerged. At last, the temple was complete. the Ark of the Covenant was carried into the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber, the most sacred place in Israel. Its walls gleamed with gold. Its atmosphere was filled with expectation. Then, according to biblical tradition, a cloud filled the temple. The priests could no longer stand to minister. The presence of God had filled the house built in his honor. For 7 years, 183,000 people had labored toward this moment. Every stone cut in darkness. Every cedar beam hauled across mountains. Every ounce of gold carefully placed. And now the mission was complete. Yet history carried a warning. The financial burden strained Solomon's kingdom. The labor system fueled future unrest. And 373 years later, Babylon destroyed the temple in fire. But its story never disappeared. Because beyond the gold, beyond the wealth, and beyond the architecture, Solomon's temple asks a timeless question. What are we building today that will outlast us tomorrow? And if you could ask King Solomon one question about this extraordinary project, what would it be? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the lost worlds of history.